Tight V, Toy Sang Tak MT Ko Chwinking D CNH Sat, Horror Police Story, HPDN, C Avid Acuto was Sancto. Avid Circumflex Y La PHN 1 CA Ko Chwena, C with BNG Tingang NH BNUCU. What Toys M Bokak Cheat Tit What Ting Tit S Me M, Khom Tring LP. Toys T10 Choko Chwenala, The Whispering Archive. The Whispering Archive Part 1. The transfer the rain in Blackwood City wasn't a cleansing shower. It was a perpetual, all-slick drizzle, coating everything in a mirror-like sheen that only reflected the gloom. Detective Sergeant Elias Thorne wasn't a man who moved. He prowled. 43, a frame built like a fire hydrant, and eyes the color of old river silt. His reputation preceded him like the scent of ozone before a lightning strike, a relentless closer, a man who saw the logic in madness, and who, 2 years ago, had almost been broken by the case of the silent carver. Almost. His new assignment was supposed to be a reprieve, a quiet desk job after a mandatory psychological evaluation. The location: the Blackwood City Police Department's Archival Processing Unit, Sublevel 3. "Welcome to the basement, Thorne," Captain Rauk said, his voice echoing in the concrete stairwell. Rauk was a man whose skin looked permanently damp. He handed Thorne a heavy brass key and a clipboard thicker than a textbook. "Processing," Thorne grunted, taking the key. "That's a nice word for storage." "It's more than storage. It's the dead file repository. Every case, every piece of evidence, every interview tape from the last 40 years that's gone cold, closed, or deemed inconclusive ends up here. Your job is to digitize it, catalog it, make it disappear into the cloud," Rauk explained, adjusting his tie nervously. "No field work, no suspects, just ghosts on paper." Rauk pointed to a narrow steel door marked with flaking paint, APU S3, access restricted. "And I mean restricted, Thorne. You're the only one down here. No janitors, no other staff. It's soundproofed, airtight, and the air conditioning is set to freezer level to preserve the paper. The system is entirely off-grid, no external connection. Security reasons." Thorne pushed the door open. The air that rushed out was instantly chilling, carrying the faint, metallic scent of iron and ozone, overlaid with a musty, almost sweet aroma, like dried blood and old perfume. The room was vast, a suffocating maze of towering steel shelves stretching into the darkness, illuminated only by a handful of flickering fluorescent tubes that hummed with a sickly, persistent drone. The sheer volume of failure stored here was palpable. The shelves were crammed with standardized, unlabeled archive boxes. Thousands upon thousands of them, each holding a fragment of the city's worst nightmares. "The server farm is in the back," Rauk said quickly, refusing to step inside. "It's all running. Instructions are in the binder. Lock the door when you leave. And Thorne, one last thing." Rauk leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, his eyes wide. "They say the paper breathes down here. That when you read enough of the cold files, you can hear the whispers of the victims and the killers mixed together. Don't listen to the ghosts, detective. Just do the work." Thorne watched the captain practically sprint back up the stairs, the sound of his quickening footsteps vanishing in the dead air. He was alone. He tossed the clipboard onto a dilapidated metal desk, the sound loud and abrasive in the silence. The cold was immediate, seeping into his bones. He reached for the thermostat on the wall. It was caged and padlocked. Thorne pulled out the first archive box at random. It was heavy. The label on the lid was faded typewritten text. Case file 77-091. The River Killer. 1977, 4 victims. Inconclusive. He lifted the lid. The first thing he noticed wasn't the files, but a single, meticulously folded piece of thick, crimson cardstock resting on top. It wasn't police evidence. It looked like an old-fashioned RSVP card. Thorne picked it up. He unfolded it slowly. Written inside, in elegant, sloping calligraphy, was a single, cryptic phrase: "We were waiting for the next curator." A sudden, sharp metallic thunk echoed from the far end of the darkened aisle. Thorne froze, his hand instinctively going to the empty holster at his hip. The air conditioning drone momentarily faltered, and in the sudden, absolute silence, Thorne could swear he heard a faint, rasping sigh just behind him, too close to be an echo. He slowly turned around, the brass key heavy and cold in his left hand. The dark corridor of the archives was empty, but the scent of old perfume and iron had intensified, and now, undeniably, there was a new smell, bitter and acrid, like the faint, lingering odor of burnt paper. Thorne stood motionless in the freezing silence of sublevel 3, his senses on high alert. He was a creature of urban chaos. This unnatural quiet felt like a physical pressure on his eardrums. He stared down the dark canyon of the archive aisle. Nothing moved. It was the vast, unbroken darkness between the humming fluorescent tubes that played tricks on the eye, making the stacks of boxes seem to lean inward. He dismissed the noise. A settling pipe, a heavy file box finally giving way to gravity. He was under stress. The mind manufactures threats in isolation. Yet, the smell of burnt paper lingered. He looked back at the desk. The crimson RSVP card still lay on the desk beside the open box of the River Killer. He smoothed the card flat. The phrase, "We were waiting for the next curator," was chillingly deliberate, not a random note. It implied awareness, a welcoming committee for his arrival. Who had left it? And how? Captain Rauch had insisted Thorne was the only one with access. Thorne picked up the clipboard and flipped through the instructions. Standard bureaucratic boilerplate. Inventory, scan, cross-reference, destroy physical records after digital confirmation. The entire process was designed to be solitary and clinical. He returned to the file box. Beneath where the card had rested, the police files were standard issue, yellowed and brittle. He started the review, flipping through crime scene photos, witness statements, and autopsy reports. All the typical signs of an inconclusive case: shoddy initial police work, conflicting timelines, and a terrifying lack of motive. The River Killer was never identified. Thorne reached the section of the file detailing the evidence found at the fourth victim scene, a woman named Lena Rauch, no relation to the captain, the file noted. There was a small, sealed evidence bag containing a piece of fabric and a note. Inconclusive. Possible garment scrap. Fiber analysis failed. Thorne held the bag up to the poor light. The scrap was small, dark, and utterly unremarkable. But it was what was not in the file that stopped his breath. He knew cold cases. He knew how police officers marked up files during review. Yet, on this page, and on several others detailing the victim profiles, there were distinct, jarring markings. Not in blue or black ink, but in a thick, vibrant red marker. These weren't official notations. They were crude, almost violent circles drawn around specific, often minute details. A circle around the phrase, "missing engagement ring," in the property list of victim 1. A frantic scribble next to the time of death of victim 3, approx. 1:17 a.m. And most disturbing, a large, heavy circle around the witness description of the fourth victim's car, a faded blue sedan, license plate inconclusive. Who had reviewed this file and used a kindergarten marker to highlight these details? And why? Thorne tried to rationalize it as a previous detective's personal, unauthorized attempt to crack the case. But the marks felt fresh. He pulled out the digital scanner and began feeding the files. Inventory, scan, cross-reference. The machine whirred loudly, chewing through the paper. As the scanner processed the final pages of the River Killer file, the lights in the archive suddenly dimmed, dropping the vast room into a near-total blackness, leaving only the sickly glow of the scanner screen. The humming stopped. The cold air unit went silent. Thorn's heartbeat was a sudden, roaring drum in his ears. The power was out, or at least cut to this sublevel. Then, from the darkness of the deepest aisle, he heard it. It wasn't a whisper. It was the distinct, loud snick of an archive box being forcibly pulled out of a tightly packed shelf. The noise was followed by the soft, dragging sound of something heavy being pulled across the concrete floor, slowly, deliberately, coming closer. He grabbed the nearest, heaviest object, a metal file tray, and held it like a club. He strained his eyes into the oppressive darkness, but he saw nothing but the outlines of the metal shelves shifting and swimming in the gloom. Then, a sound that made the hairs on his neck stand straight up. A rhythmic, wet thud, thud, thud hitting the desk behind him. He slowly turned, flashlight beam cutting through the dark. Lying on the surface of his desk, precisely where the crimson RSVP card had been, was a freshly catalogued evidence tag. The tag was pristine white, and scrawled across it in thick, still wet, vibrant red marker was a single word: look. The word, look, scrawled in fresh red marker on the evidence tag was a punch to the gut. The smell of the marker's ink was chemical and sharp, overriding the archive's old mustiness. This was not a ghost. This was a person, or something with the physical capability to move and write. Thorn aimed his flashlight beam at the source of the dragging sound. The powerful beam cut through the intense darkness, revealing the far end of the aisle. The noise was gone, but his light caught a subtle detail. A faint, fresh scratch mark scoring the dusty concrete floor, leading back into the darkness. He grabbed the key and ran to the steel access door, padlocked from the outside, just as Rawak had left it. There was no other entry point. If the lock was untouched, whoever, or whatever, was down here with him had either never left, or had used an unseen access point. The captain's emphasis on the sublevel being airtight and soundproofed suddenly felt less like a security measure and more like a trap. Thorn returned to the desk, his mind racing. He was locked in with an intelligent presence manipulating evidence. He looked at the red mark tag. Look. He spun around and shone his light back into the darkness of the aisles. If he was being guided, what was he supposed to be looking for? He scanned the towering shelves, the thousands of boxes of failed cases. The River Killer box was still open on his desk. Thorn pulled out the heavy clipboard again. If someone was trying to communicate through the files, they must be leaving a trail. He flipped through the instruction binder. The pages were clean, except for one small detail on the third page, detailing the procedure for inactive audio evidence. Below the dry instructions, a faint, almost invisible arrow had been sketched in pencil, pointing specifically at one line. All audio tapes, reel-to-reel, cassette, micro, are stored in section Gamma 7, climate control vents AB. Thorn located the aisle markers. Gamma 7 was 3 aisles over. He kept his back to the wall, moving slowly, his flashlight sweeping side to side, illuminating the claustrophobic corridors of failure. Section Gamma 7 was a small cage lined with fireproof shelves, housing countless tiny boxes of obsolete recording media. Thorn found the shelf marked Vents AB. He pulled out a box labeled Case 77-091, Supplemental Evidence, Tape 1. The River Killer case. Inside the box, the cassette tape was unremarkable, except for a large, ugly crack running through its clear plastic casing. It was broken. Thorn carefully picked up the tape. It felt unnaturally light. The label was old, but again, across the top of the label, a thick, angry streak of red marker had been drawn. He carried the tape back to the desk. The digitization kit included an ancient-looking cassette player, necessary for preserving the archaic format. Thorn powered it up and carefully fed the cracked tape into the slot. He pressed play. A loud, piercing squeal of feedback filled the dead archive, followed by static. Then, a low, muffled voice. The original detective conducting a routine interview. So you saw the blue sedan leave the area around 1:20 a.m. A woman's shaky voice. Yes, detective. It was right after I heard the scream. Just a quick flash of the tail lights, the tape suddenly distorted, the audio slowing down, the voices dropping in pitch until they sounded demonic and garbled. Then, the tape skipped. The interview was replaced by a strange, low-frequency sound. Not static, but a deliberate recording of something else entirely. It sounded like heavy, rasping breathing, slow, methodical, and deeply resonant. The sound filled the room, making the air feel heavy. Then, within the breathing, a faint, high-pitched clicking began. A repeated, sharp sound, almost like a code. Thorn recognized the sound instantly. It wasn't the victim's voice. It was the distinct sound of a very small microphone being turned on and off, a cheap tape recorder. And in the pause between the clicks, a quiet, controlled voice. Click. The voice, faint and breathy, sounding as if it were right next to the mic. Found at the ring. Click. He was watching. Click. Click. The curator knows the truth of the broken. The tape suddenly ceased, issuing a loud, metallic shriek of tearing magnetic film, and stopped dead. Thorn stared at the cassette player. The broken tape had given him a key piece of information, something the official files had deliberately omitted. The killer had been recording the investigation, or perhaps the final moments of the victims. And someone, possibly the person marking the files, knew the truth of the broken. Thorn looked down at the physical tape he had just played. The tape was broken. The power was broken. The file was broken. He looked up at the vast, dark expanse of the archive, now completely silent again. He knew, with an unsettling certainty, that the river killer wasn't an inconclusive case, and he wasn't alone. He was the focus of the curator, who was meticulously leaving him a trail in red. Suddenly, a loud, heavy crash erupted from the ceiling above. Something large and metallic had fallen in the vents. It was followed by a sharp scraping sound, growing rapidly louder, as if something was being dragged or was actively crawling directly through the air ducts toward the sublevel 3 intake fan. The air in the archive began to stir and swirl violently. The sound from the ceiling was primal, not the gentle groan of old infrastructure, but the harsh, metallic grinding of something heavy tearing its way through the ventilation system. The ceiling panels rattled violently, showering Thorn's desk with dust and flakes of paint. He reacted on instinct. Dropping the broken tape and grabbing the metal file tray, ready to use it as a shield or a weapon. He backed away from the desk, scanning the ceiling directly above the air intake vent, a large, rusted grate set high on the wall. The grating vibrated fiercely, and the smell of ozone and burnt paper intensified, now mixed with a sickly sweet, decaying odor. The scraping stopped directly above the vent. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. Thorn aimed his flashlight. The metal grate was shaking slightly. Clang. A heavy, sickening thud resonated through the vent. Something inside had impacted the grate from above. Then, a low, wet gurgle. A sound that was unmistakably biological, like lungs filling with fluid, emanated from the ductwork. Blackwood Police, identify yourself. Thorn yelled, his voice sounding thin and desperate in the echoing archive. The response was a single, long, drawn-out scrape of metal on metal, as if a large, sharp object was being slowly pressed against the inside of the grate. Thorn realized the attacker wasn't trying to force entry. It was trying to communicate. He slowly approached the vent, keeping the light fixed on the grate. Suddenly, a dark, viscous liquid began to drip down from the slots in the metal grate. It wasn't water. It was thick, black, and smelled of stale copper. As the first drops hit the concrete floor, they sizzled faintly and then something appeared in the upper corner of the vent, partially obscured by the darkness and the filth. It was a single, pale finger. It was unnaturally long and thin. Its skin stretched tight over the bone, ending in a broken, dirty fingernail. The finger extended slowly through the largest gap in the grate. It wasn't moving erratically. It was pointing, rigidly and deliberately, toward a single, specific spot in the archive. Thorn followed the finger's line of direction with his flashlight. It pointed past the desk, past the open river killer box, and directly at a section of the steel shelving marked Section Delta 9, Miscellaneous Items. Rejected evidence. The finger retracted with a sickening snap. The gurgling sound in the vent faded back into a low, whispering vibration, and the scraping disappeared. Whatever it was, it had gone back up into the labyrinthine darkness of the ventilation system. Thorn waited for a full minute, flashlight cutting through the silence. Nothing. The archive was cold and still again, save for the faint, steady drip, drip, drip of the black fluid on the concrete. He had a choice. Bolt for the stairs and call Rauk, or follow the trail. Rauk had practically run from this sublevel. Calling him would only result in delay, denial, and possibly a forced psych leave. The thing in the vent had clearly been a distraction, meant only to point him towards Section Delta 9. He moved to the shelves. Section Delta 9 was far more disorganized than the rest of the APU. It contained mismatched boxes, faded plastic bags, and evidence labeled with confusing codes. These were the items too strange, too irrelevant, or too contaminated to be included in the official case files. He found the area the finger had pointed to, a shelf stacked with old manila envelopes, all unmarked. Thorn pulled down the entire stack. Dust exploded into the air. He opened the top envelope. Inside, nestled among packing peanuts, was a small, crudely fashioned wooden bird, a child's toy. Meaningless. He opened the second envelope. A desiccated bouquet of pressed lavender flowers. Nothing. The third envelope was heavier. Inside, wrapped in a brittle piece of newspaper from 1977, was a small, handheld voice recorder, a microcassette device, the same kind whose clicking sound he'd heard on the broken tape. This recorder was intact, but old, caked in. Dried dirt. And wrapped tightly around the recorder's play button. Holding it down in the record position was a scrap of fabric. It was dark, woven material, stiff with dried residue. Thorn recognized it instantly. It matched the vague description of the garment scrap from the River Killer file. The inconclusive piece of evidence that had been sealed in a plastic bag. But this one was different. On the small piece of fabric, written in the same thick, vibrant red marker, were 3 jagged letters, H.A.C. Thorn didn't hesitate. He knew the red marker was his only guide. He thumbed the play button on the dirty micro-recorder. A loud, piercing scream of raw, unadulterated human terror tore through the archive's silence, followed by the sickening, unmistakable sound of a body being rapidly dragged across a rough surface. The sheer volume and proximity of the sound made Thorn drop the recorder in shock. The audio wasn't old. It was raw. It was happening now, or had happened very recently. Then, the dragging stopped. There was a pause. And then, a cold, measured whisper, the voice devoid of inflection. A voice that was clearly speaking into the recorder from inches away. The archive sees what you hide, detective. The River Killer was just practice for the HAC. Now you know the code. Look up. Thorn's head snapped up toward the vent. But the voice wasn't coming from the ceiling. It was coming from the micro-recorder, lying on the dusty concrete floor, its tiny speaker still crackling. The archive's main power suddenly surged back on. The fluorescent lights flickered back to life with a blinding intensity, and the chilling drone of the air conditioning unit roared back into operation. The sudden brightness was disorienting. Thorn looked around wildly. He was alone. But on the metallic side of the shelf marked section Delta 9, high above his head, the return of the light revealed a new addition. Scratched deeply into the steel, not with a marker, but with what looked like a tool, was a message, a series of codes running horizontally along the shelf. 77-091, RK. Vertical bar 82 to 203, vertical bar 91 to 447, HSE. Vertical bar 04-119, 4 case numbers. 4 broken files, connected by the red marker and the voice. Thorn realized the HSE was not a person, but a code for the next case he needed to find. He didn't have to look far. The file marked case 91 to 447 was stored exactly 2 aisles away, directly beneath the still dripping black fluid from the ventilation fan. Detective Thorn was no stranger to panic, but this was different. This wasn't the adrenaline of a foot chase. It was the icy dread of realization. The archive was not a static repository of the past. It was an active crime scene, constantly curated by a hidden intelligence. The HSE was not only watching, it was anticipating his every move. He focused on the new case code scratched into the metal. 91-447. He found the box directly under the dripping black residue from the ventilation shaft. The label read, Case File 91 to 447. The Widow's Weaver. Unidentified. Inconclusive. Thorn pulled the box down. It felt too light. He opened it. Instead of the standard police reports, crime scene photos, and evidence logs, the box contained only one thing: a single, large piece of stiff, yellowed construction paper, folded precisely in half. Thorn unfolded the paper. It was a drawing. It was rendered in crayon and colored pencil, amateurish yet meticulous. It was a top-down, aerial view, a hand-drawn map of the Blackwood City Police Department's Sublevel 3 archive. The layout was chillingly accurate, detailing the aisles, the server farm, the steel access door, and even the dilapidated metal desk where Thorn was currently standing. But the map wasn't just a floor plan. It was annotated. Small, cramped handwriting labeled the map's key features. Aisle Gamma 7, tapes here lie the whispers. Aisle Delta 9, rejected evidence where we placed the gift. The server farm, digital storage, the keeper's throne. And then, prominently marked in the dead center of the map, right in the middle of the APU S3 floor, was a large, angry circle drawn in the familiar, vibrant red marker. Inside the circle, a single word: truth. The circle encompassed a section of the floor that Thorn knew was empty, a dead space between 4 of the tallest shelving units, an area he had just passed. The map was telling him to look at the floor. As he turned the map over, he noticed a faint, oily smudge on the back of the paper. He held the map up to the flickering light. The smudge was a nearly invisible watermark or stamp, visible only when the paper was angled. It was the Blackwood City Police Department's archival seal. But the text below the shield was altered, rendered barely legible by the heavy pressure of the stamp. Instead of reading APU, official use only, it seemed to read APU, all positions undertaken. This wasn't just evidence, it was official stationery, stamped, yet bearing a hidden message. The HSE wasn't just an external observer. They had access to police assets, or were police assets. Thorn dropped the map back in the box and moved immediately to the location indicated by the red circle. The section was dark and dusty. The concrete floor here felt slightly cooler than the rest of the archive. He kicked at the floor, expecting resistance. Instead, his boot scraped something loose. He knelt down and swept the dust away. He found a seam, a thin, jagged line of sealant that had been expertly concealed beneath years of archive dust. The concrete in this small, roughly 3-foot square section was clearly cut and inserted. Like a hatch. He ran his fingers along the seam and located a tiny, almost microscopic notch near the center. He jammed the point of his heavy brass archive key into the notch and levered it up. The square of concrete slab lifted easily, revealing a small, shallow cavity underneath. Not a basement or a tunnel, but a simple, concealed locker. Inside the locker, bathed in the beam of his flashlight, was a tightly wrapped bundle sealed in heavy plastic. It was the size and shape of a human forearm. Thorn carefully unwrapped the plastic. Inside was a large, leather-bound journal, its cover deeply embossed with a faded, gold-stamped insignia he didn't recognize. The leather was supple but smelled faintly of mildew and human sweat. He opened the journal to the first page. It wasn't a diary, it was a ledger. Each page was a meticulous, handwritten catalogue of cases, organized not by number, but by a personal, terrifying classification. System: the silent ones, 4 cases; the broken ones, 6 cases, including 77-091 RK. The chosen ones, 3 cases, including 91-447 WW. The journal's penmanship was elegant, controlled, and chillingly sane. Thorn flipped to the page detailing case 91-447, the widow's weaver. The official police file had been empty, but the journal offered a full, detailed, and utterly personal account of the murders, complete with dates, times, and methods of disposal. At the bottom of the entry for 91-447, there was a separate, typed note pasted neatly onto the page, bearing a name: Lead Detective on APU Transfer, Officer Elias Thorn. The journal entry was dated 3 days ago. The author knew he was coming. Just as Thorn processed this, the lights in the archive began to strobe, not flickering, but flashing rhythmically, casting the shelves and aisles into violent, dizzying shadows. And then, over the roar of the air conditioning, a sound emerged, a high, whining vibration, not from the vents, but from the server farm at the back of the archive. The server farm, which Rauk had called the Keeper's Throne on the map, was beginning to sing. Thorn looked back at the leather journal in his hands, then at the strobelit room. He knew the HSE was communicating through the entire infrastructure of sublevel 3. He quickly flipped to the final page of the journal. There was one last entry, written in the same elegant script, and it was addressed directly to him. The key opens the archive, Elias. But the truth opens the file. We've kept the most precious piece of evidence safe until your arrival. Go to the Keeper's Throne, Thorn. Your final confession awaits inside. The strobing lights abruptly stopped. The room plunged into absolute blackness, darker and more profound than before. The only light was his flashlight, fixed on the leather journal, and the only sound was the distant, high-pitched whining of the server farm, which now sounded less like technology and more like a sustained, inhuman cry. The sudden, absolute blackness was disorienting, but Thorn was a man forged in the dark. He secured the leather journal inside his jacket, its weight a cold reassurance. The chilling, high-pitched whine from the server farm was the only anchor in the void. It was a beckoning sound, metallic and resonant, like a tuning fork struck against bone. He navigated the maze of shelves, moving toward the noise. The back section of sublevel 3 was dominated by the server farm, a large, climate-controlled steel cage designed to house the digital heart of the archive. The map had labeled it the Keeper's Throne. He reached the wire mesh cage. The access door, usually secured by a magnetic lock, was hanging ajar, its lock mechanism visibly smashed inward. Thorn entered the server room. The air instantly felt warmer, dense with the heat generated by rows of powerful, humming machines. The sound was deafening now, A mechanical scream of spinning drives and overworked cooling fans. He swept his flashlight beam across the racks. The machines were modern, powerful, and built for maximum security. A paradox considering the ancient paper archive surrounding them. He noticed the air quality. The metallic, sweet odor of the archive was strongest here, concentrated by the heat. It felt like standing inside a pressurized copper chamber. The whining noise intensified. Thorn located the source. A single, large, central server rack, designated as 01. The lights on its front panel were blinking erratically, a frantic, non-standard pattern that looked like Morse code blinking at hyperspeed. He moved to the rear of the S01 rack, where the main access panels were secured. He needed to find the confession the journal had promised. The rear panel of S01 was also visibly tampered with. The screws holding the heavy metal panel in place were bent, as if they'd been ripped out by extreme force. Thorn pulled the panel off. The immediate smell was overpowering, a blast of ozone, heat, and the distinct, cloying sweetness of old perfume. Inside the server unit, it wasn't just electronics. Nestled between the hot cables and cooling coils, partially melted by the heat of the machine, was a small, cloth-bound book. A personal diary. Thorn carefully extracted the diary. It was hot to the touch. It was not labeled, but tucked into the front cover, visible through a plastic sleeve, was a police ID card. Thorn pulled out the ID card and shone his flashlight on the face. The shock hit him like a physical blow. The photo was old, but recognizable. The face of a young, handsome patrol officer named Marcus Rauch. The same last name as the captain who had assigned him to this tomb. Thorn flipped the diary open. The handwriting was neat, clear, and recent. The first entry was a list of names. The 4 victims of the river killer, case 77-091, and the 3 victims of the widow's weaver, case 91-447. The next page detailed the precise mechanism of their deaths, information that was classified and had never been made public. The entry for the current week contained a single, chilling paragraph. He is here. Elias Thorn, the new curator. They sent him to clean up the mess, but he will only find our truth. I showed him the broken tape. I showed him the map. He is focused on the victims, but the archive has always been about the curators, the ones who control the memory. Now, it's his turn to inherit the burden. Rauch, Thorn whispered, the realization solidifying the horror. The captain hadn't just been nervous. He was running from his own family's history. The HSC must stand for something personal, something rooted in the police department itself. He flipped to the last written page. It wasn't an entry. It was a schematic diagram. A complex, hand-drawn blueprint of the electrical wiring for the entire APU sublevel 3.1 specific junction box, located near the main entrance door, was circled heavily in that same vibrant red marker. A small handwritten note accompanied the circle. The loop must be closed. The switch for the final archive is here. Thorn, look at your hand. Thorn looked down at the hand holding the diary. The light on the cover reflected the faint gleam of the brass key he still held. The archive key. He flipped the diary back to the ID card. Marcus Rauch. The police ID card was cracked, and as Thorn held it, the plastic coating peeled away slightly. Beneath the photo, on the brittle cardstock, he saw a hidden acronym pressed into the material. H.A.C. Head Archival Curator. The family lineage wasn't just storing the files. They were maintaining the silence. The killers were the broken ones. The Rauchs were the curators. The whine from the S01 server rack suddenly cut off. The sudden silence was absolute. Then, from the darkness of the aisles, Thorn heard a faint, familiar scraping sound. But this time, it wasn't heavy or dragging. It was light, fast, and accompanied by a rapid, Rhythmic tap 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 of something small bouncing on the concrete floor. Turning his flashlight toward the sound. A small, shiny object rolled out of the shadow of a tall shelf, stopping just before the server cage. It was a small, polished brass bullet casing, and as Thorn looked closer, he saw that the casing wasn't empty. Something was jammed inside the mouth of the casing, wrapped in a tiny piece of brittle paper. He quickly picked up the casing. It was warm. He used the point of the brass key to pry out the paper. The note, written in cramped, desperate handwriting, not the elegant script of the diary, but a panicked scrawl, contained only 3 words: "He is here," followed by a single, terrifying location: main door. The power to the server cage suddenly went out, plunging Thorn into darkness again. The server room door slammed shut and the magnetic lock clacked into place, sealing him inside the keeper's throne. He was trapped, and the curator was at the main door, waiting to close the final loop. The slam of the steel cage door and the sharp clack of the magnetic lock were absolute. Thorn was sealed inside the server farm, the keeper's throne, with the heavy, warm metal of the S01 rack pressing against his back. He grabbed the heavy brass key and rammed it repeatedly into the broken magnetic lock, but it was useless. The door was industrial grade, designed to hold. He was isolated, and the curator was at the main exit, securing his position. He shone his light around the cage. The main power was cut, but the emergency battery packs for the server racks were still hissing faintly. He had to find another way out, or disarm the lock from the inside. Thorn remembered the schematic in the diary, the diagram of the electrical wiring and the red-marked junction box near the main APU door. The note had said, "The loop must be closed. The switch for the final archive is here." He looked closely at the inside wall of the server cage, near the smashed lock. He found a small, recessed panel for emergency system overrides. A mess of wires and fuses designed to be tamper-proof. He jammed the tip of the brass key into the panel seam and leveraged it open. A tangle of color-coded wires spilled out. He needed to find the line that fed the magnetic lock on the cage door. He worked quickly, flashlight clenched in his teeth. He identified the thick red and black lines leading to the lock mechanism. He had no tool. He used the sharp edge of the brass key, scraping away the plastic insulation until the copper wires were exposed. As he prepared to short the wires, a new sound cut through the silence outside the cage. It was the heavy, labored clunk of the main sublevel 3 steel door being secured, not just locked, but bolted from the outside. Then, a voice, low, measured, and heavily amplified, echoing off the vast walls of the archive. "Detective Thorn, welcome to the HSE induction ceremony." It was Captain Rauch, but the voice was flatter, colder, imbued with a shocking, cruel clarity. The voice of a man relieved to drop a pretense. Thorn froze, his hands poised over the wires. "I imagine you found Marcus' journal." "Yes, the Rauch family are the head archival curators. Not for the files, detective. For the truth. We don't hide the evidence. We consolidate it. We filter it. The broken ones were simply catalysts for our work." Rauch laughed, a dry, unsettling sound that bounced through the concrete aisles. "The HSE code? It's the key to the final file. You see, the river killer was the first. The widow's weaver was the second. But the third case, the one connected to the brass casing you just found, is case 04-119. A case you know very well, Elias." Thorn's breath hitched. "Case 04-119. The silent carver. His own case. The one that had nearly broken him. You failed to find the silent carver, Elias," Rauch continued, his voice closer now, standing just outside the server cage. "But the archive found him. The final piece of evidence from that file, the only piece we didn't destroy, is here. It's the Final archive, you were led to. Thorn snapped the exposed wires together. A bright, blue spark erupted, followed by a loud pop from the lock panel. The magnetic lock failed, and the server cage door swung heavily inward. Thorn burst out of the cage, the brass key raised as a makeshift weapon. Captain Rauk was standing 20 feet away, near the heavy steel exit door. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a large, military-grade clipboard, the kind used for demolition schematics, and a standard-issue police flare gun. Rauk smiled, a vacant, terrifying expression. Took you long enough, Curator. Rauk dropped the clipboard to the ground. Thorn saw it was covered in more red marker. Attached to the top was the red circle schematic from the journal. Rauk fired the flare gun. The burning projectile streaked past Thorn's head and slammed directly into the red-marked junction box near the main entrance door. The junction box exploded in a shower of sparks. The entire building power grid for sublevel 3 went completely dark. The final element of the HSE system was activated. The server racks in the cage began to shriek again, a sound now amplified 1,000-fold. This wasn't a mechanical whine. It was an electronic echo of every scream, every desperate plea, every cold whisper recorded in the archives for 40 years. The noise became a physical force. Thorn shielded his ears, dropping to one knee. The sound vibrated in his chest, making his bones ache. Listen to the truth, Thorn. They all died in silence. Rauk screamed over the sound, his face illuminated by the flickering red glow of the dying flare near the junction box. Rauk pointed past Thorn, toward the vast, dark shelving units. The final archive is yours, Elias. It's the only original evidence from the silent Carver case. You digitized and destroyed everything else. But we saved this. Go to the coordinates. Curator, it's time to face your failure. Rauk kicked the heavy brass bolts on the main steel door, securing it fully. He then turned and disappeared instantly into the blackness of the archive aisles, swallowed by the screaming noise and the dark. Thorn struggled to his feet. The noise was unbearable, the archive shelves seemingly vibrating and breathing around him. He needed to find that one last piece of evidence. He looked at the clipboard Rauk had dropped. The schematic. Beneath the red circle junction box, Rauk had scrawled a final, 4-digit set of coordinates in thick red marker. N12. The location was the deepest, darkest corner of the archive, in a section reserved for oversized evidence boxes. Thorn took a deep breath, ignoring the screaming voices, and ran toward the final coordinates. The voices were telling him something, and he had to know what the silent Carver had left behind. The scream of the archive was a living entity now, a cacophony of distorted human misery echoing off the concrete. The sound was designed to shatter reason, a terrifying symphony of every unresolved case. Thorn used the pain as fuel, forcing himself deeper into the maze toward coordinates N12. The air conditioning unit was fighting the heat from the shorted junction box, creating swirling drafts that made the shadows dance. The intense sonic vibration caused loose papers to flutter and fall from the higher shelves, snowing down on Thorn as he ran. He found Section N, the aisle reserved for oddly shaped and oversized evidence. The shelving was wider here, casting deeper, more oppressive shadows. The digital whine was slightly muffled, allowing the individual whispers of the archive to cut through the noise. Quick, choked phrases, names, and snippets of pleas rushing past his ears like cold air. He reached the final shelf, marked 12. It held a single object, larger than a standard file box. A heavy, wooden crate, sealed with rusted industrial staples. The crate was old, covered in dust, and completely unmarked save for a single, small piece of white tape stuck near the top. Scrawled on the tape, not in red marker, but in faint, almost invisible pencil, was the label Case 04-119, Final piece. Thorn immediately noticed the state of the crate. It wasn't just dusty. The wood near the top had been scratched deeply, almost obsessively, by something sharp. He ran his hand over the grooves. They weren't random damage. They formed a crude, repeating pattern. A series of deep, vertical lines, carved in groups of 3. He knelt, pulling out the small, makeshift crowbar he carried in his boot. A piece of reinforced tire iron he always kept for emergencies. He jammed it under the lip of the crate and yanked. The rusted staples shrieked as they tore out of the wood. Thorn threw open the lid. The odor that hit him was immediate and overwhelming. Formaldehyde, dried earth, and a potent, musky scent. Like old wool and sweat. The crate was lined with burlap. And inside, resting on a bed of what looked like dried moss and shredded paper, was the final piece of evidence from the silent carver case. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a victim's personal item. It was a full-sized, expertly rendered sculpture of a human head, carved from a solid block of dark, dense wood. The carving was lifelike, captured in a moment of utter terror. The face was gaunt, the eyes hollowed out in an agonizing, silent scream. The detail was incredible. Every tense muscle, every furrowed brow. The silent carver's victims were always found with their vocal cords chemically paralyzed, their screams trapped forever. The carver's signature was to leave the victim in a posture of silent terror. Thorn recognized the face instantly. It was the face of the final victim, the one whose case he had been forced to close as inconclusive. A woman named Sarah Vance. But the horror was in the detail. Etched painstakingly into the wood of the sculpture's forehead, just above the brow, was a single, tiny, perfectly formed letter, E. Elias. The carver had left his initial on his victim, a message meant only for him. Thorn felt a crushing weight of guilt and dread. He hadn't just failed to catch the carver. The carver had known him, studied him, and was mocking him from beyond the grave, or, more terrifyingly, from the dark corners of the archive. He looked back at the server cage. The sound of the screaming archive abruptly cut out, replaced by the sharp, amplified, and clearly audible voice of Captain Rauch, broadcast through the now-fixed ventilation system. "You see it now, Elias? He saw you." The carver, like the curators, saw the potential in the archive. He knew which files would be destroyed, which would be saved, and where the final piece belonged. The HSE system isn't just about preserving crimes, it's about preserving the relationship between the killer and the investigator. Marcus Rauch, my father, mentored the carver. He taught him the archive. Rauch's voice, amplified through the metal ducts, was chillingly close. The carver only carved one thing into his victims that was personal. A tiny mark, a signature on the silence. He was your killer, Elias. And now, the carver's final gift is the ultimate key. Rauch's voice dropped to a near whisper, yet the amplification made it sound like it was right inside Thorn's ear. "Look at the back of the head, Elias. The final archive is hidden within the silence." Thorn flipped the heavy wooden head over. The back of the skull was smooth, save for a small, shallow indentation. He ran his finger over the spot. He felt a faint, recessed line, a tiny seam. The sculpture was hollow. He looked around wildly for a tool, then remembered the brass key. He inserted the tip into the tiny seam and twisted with all his strength. With a dry creak, the back of the wooden skull popped open. Inside the hollowed cavity, nestled deep in the darkness, was a single, called item. Thorn pulled it out. It was a long, thin, human vocal cord, dried and preserved with chemicals, tied with a simple piece of thick, crimson ribbon, the same crimson color as the RSVP card he had found on his desk in part 1. Attached to the ribbon was a small, folded note written in the carver's neat, clinical hand. Detective Thorn. The screams are silent in the wood. But the truth is always saved in the place where the pain begins. Thorn was horrified, sickened. This was the one piece of original, organic evidence that proved the carver's methods, preserved and hidden by the HSC curators. Suddenly, a loud, metallic clang came from the main steel entrance door. Rauk was forcing the outer lock with a heavy tool. The steel door was about to breach. Thorn had the truth, the proof of the HSC conspiracy. But he was trapped deep in the archive with a desperate, armed man closing in. He looked down the aisle and saw the first flicker of light from Rauk's advancing flashlight. He had to move, and he had to use the archive against its master. The metallic groan of the main door lock failing was loud and final. Captain Rauk was moments away from breaching the archive. Thorn knew he couldn't outfight Rauk. The captain was armed, desperate, and knew the sublevel intimately. His only advantage was the chaos of the HSC system itself. Thorn tucked the wooden head, the vocal cord, and Marcus Rauk's journal inside the evidence crate. He had to secure the evidence. He slammed the lid shut and used the tire iron to bend the staples back into place. He looked around. The massive shelving units. The dead air. The only thing Rauk hadn't tampered with was the original, archaic structure of the archive. Thorn noticed the deep, repeating patterns of scratches on the wooden crate, 3 vertical lines, repeating. He looked back at the main aisles. The shelves were anchored to the floor by heavy steel cables, crisscrossing in groups. He suddenly remembered a security measure he'd learned during his early days. An anti-theft design used in old high-security evidence rooms. He grabbed the tire iron and began hammering it against the base of the shelving unit at N12. The noise was dull, but persistent. Clang. Clang. Rauk's voice, now closer, was distorted by anger and effort. You can't hide it, Thorn. It's over. You've seen too much. Thorn ignored him. He found the central anchor point for the shelving unit, the bolt securing the massive structure to the concrete floor. He jammed the flat end of the tire iron under the bolt and lifted, just enough to loosen the tension. The shelves in this archive were interconnected in blocks of 4, forming rigid columns. If one shelf fell, the entire block would cascade like dominoes. He repeated the process on the adjacent shelving block, loosening to main floor anchors. It was a risky, desperate move, but it was his only chance to create a physical barrier. He heard the final, tearing sound of the main steel door. Rauk was in. Thorn raced back toward the center of the archive, carrying the heavy evidence crate. He needed to find the source of Rauk's current power, the ventilation speaker. He reached the central intersection. The light from Rauk's powerful flashlight, mounted on his weapon, cut a sharp, sweeping beam through the dust-filled air from the main entrance. The evidence is irrelevant now, Elias. Rauk's voice boomed, amplified through the vents. The loop is closed. You failed to save your victims, and you will fail to save yourself. Thorn looked up. He found the ventilation grill where Rauk's amplified voice was emanating, a large metal grate about 10 feet up the wall. He placed the evidence crate down, climbed onto the dilapidated metal desk, and balanced precariously on the edge. He used the sharp end of the brass key, jamming it into the slots of the grill. He felt the wires of the speaker system beneath the metal. Rauk's light beam found him. Stop, or I will put you through the wall. Thorn pulled his hand back, just as a shot rang out. Rauk's bullet missed, tearing a chunk of plaster from the wall next to the vent. You're too late, Curator. Thorn yelled. He grabbed the nearest heavy object, a brick-sized lead weight used for stabilizing shelving, and hurled it at the vent. It struck the thin metal grate with a violent crunch. The amplified sound of Rauk's voice immediately cut out, replaced by a horrible, rasping static. The air in the archive returned to a strained, nervous silence. Rauk was disoriented. The sonic weapon was gone. You broke the silence. Rauk roared from the darkness. You only broke the law, Captain, Thorn retorted. Jumping down from the desk, Thorn ran, dragging the heavy evidence crate with him. He had to get to the stairs. He needed to get the evidence out. He heard Rauk's heavy, panicked footsteps pursuing him through the aisles. Rauk was closing the distance fast. Thorn reached the aisle leading directly to the stairwell access door. But just before the door, Rauk stepped out of the shadow of a tall shelf, blocking the path. He was holding a police-issue service pistol, aimed squarely at Thorn's chest. I won't let you expose the curators, Elias. The silent carver was necessary. We maintain the equilibrium of Blackwood. You will be categorized as evidence destroyed in fire. Thorn dropped the crate at his feet. You think destroying files solves anything? The archive breathes, Rauk. It remembers. Thorn pointed the brass key, the key Rauk himself had given him, at the captain. You gave me the key to this whole operation, the brass key for the archive. But you forgot one thing about the Rauk family system. Rauk squinted, tightening his grip on the pistol. What are you talking about? The HSE system is designed to trigger a failure in the structural integrity of the oldest shelves when the power grid is shorted. A controlled collapse to bury classified evidence, Thorn said, echoing the technical details he'd seen in Marcus Rauk's journal. You shorted the junction box, Rauk. You closed the loop. Rauk's eyes widened in dawning terror. No, my father wouldn't. Your father built the mechanism to bury his failures, Captain. And you just triggered it, Thorn spat. As if on cue. A loud, thunderous crack echoed from the deep and 12 section. The shelves Thorn had deliberately destabilized had finally given way. A terrifying, grinding rumble began, rapidly advancing through the archive. The entire structure of the steel shelving units began to shudder, tilt, and collapse in a devastating wave of falling metal and paper. It was coming directly for them. The sound of the structural collapse was instantaneous and overwhelming. A deafening, grinding roar of tortured steel and cascading debris. The wave of falling shelves advanced with terrifying speed, tearing through the archive like a geological event. Captain Rauk, his face contorted in disbelief and terror, momentarily lowered his pistol. He understood the mechanism Thorn was referencing. A failsafe his father, the original curator, had designed to bury the most dangerous truths under tons of steel and concrete dust. You killed us both, Rauk screamed, realizing the main steel door was now locked and bolted, and the falling shelves were blocking the stairwell access. You closed the loop, Captain. Thorn yelled back, diving behind the overturned metal desk for cover. Rauk was closer to the stairwell access door. He made a desperate sprint, his flashlight beam swinging wildly. He reached the heavy steel door, fumbling with the deadbolt. The wall of collapsing metal was less than 50 feet away. It wasn't just the shelves falling. The sheer force was tearing open the archive boxes, releasing decades of paper and evidence into a blinding, suffocating cloud of dust and shredded documentation. Rauk managed to unlock the deadbolt just as the first massive column of shelves slammed into the aisle closest to him. The shockwave hit the steel door, twisting the frame violently. Rauk was forced backward, hitting the floor hard. Thorn saw his chance. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing the heavy evidence crate that held the wooden head and the journal. He had to get to Rauk, but not to fight him. To use the captain's frantic exit attempt. He ran toward the main door. Rauk, dazed and struggling, was pulling himself back up, his gun having skittered away into the swirling dust. The key, Thorn. Give me the key. Rauk choked out, pointing a trembling hand at the brass archive key Thorn still held. The key was necessary to open the outer main lock on the steel door. Thorn reached Rauk, grabbing the back of his jacket collar. You're going to open the lock, Captain. He shoved Rauk against the door frame. Rauk, fueled by survival instinct, fumbled with the key in the top lock. His hands slick with sweat and dust. The collapse was directly behind them now. The sound was so intense it was shaking the very foundations of the sublevel. Rauk finally turned the brass key in the heavy lock. Click. Thorn through the evidence crate, containing the HSE journal and the carver's evidence, through the now-locked door and onto the concrete floor of the stairwell. Go, Rauk. Get out. Thorn roared, pushing Rauk violently through the partially open door. Rauk stumbled through the frame just as the collapsing wave reached the stairwell opening. A mountain of steel shelving, file boxes, and heavy debris slammed into the steel door. The impact was deafening. The door buckled inward, shattering the frame. Thorn threw himself into the stairwell after Rauk, just as the entire opening of sublevel 3 was choked by the massive, shifting wall of wreckage. He landed heavily on the concrete stairs, the dust cloud enveloping them both. They were safe, but the sublevel 3 archive was sealed. A tomb of failure and conspiracy. Thorn coughed violently, dragging himself up a step. Rauk, lying prone on the landing, was still alive, covered in dust and debris, staring back at the shattered doorway. You destroyed it, Rauk whispered, his voice thin with defeat. You destroyed the archive. The truth is buried. Thorn picked up the evidence crate. No, Captain. You destroyed your own conspiracy. The truth is sitting right here. He tapped the crate. And the whispers of your victims just got a hell of a lot louder. Rauk looked up at Thorn, a terrifying mix of madness and resignation in his eyes. You don't understand, Elias. You haven't closed the loop. You just opened the next archive. It was never about the basement. It's about the curator. Rauk slowly reached into his torn trouser pocket. Thorn, exhausted but ready, raised the tire iron. Rauk pulled out a small, metallic object. It wasn't a gun. It was a miniaturized, satellite-connected digital receiver, blinking with a tiny, persistent green light. It was the off-grid connection the captain had claimed didn't exist. The server farm was just a decoy. Rauk smiled, a final, horrifying gesture of victory. The real archive is stored off-site. The HSE is a network detective. And I just sent a full-access ping to the next active curator. He knows everything you know now. The small green light on the receiver suddenly turned a solid, ominous red. Rauk collapsed, his eyes rolling back. Thorn didn't know if he was dead or simply unconscious. Thorn stared at the blinking red light on the receiver, then at the sealed wreckage behind him. The whispers had stopped. The archive was silent. He picked up the small receiver, then the heavy evidence crate, and began the long climb up the dusty, echoing stairwell. He had the evidence, he had the truth about the carver. But Rauk's final act confirmed his chilling prophecy. The conspiracy wasn't over. It had just moved to a new location. And the next curator was waiting. Detective Thorn emerged from the humid gloom of the police precinct's basement stairwell and into the sterile, buzzing brightness of the main administrative floor. He was a ghost draped in dust, carrying the heavy evidence crate and the chilling knowledge of the HSE conspiracy. Captain Rauk lay unconscious, perhaps indefinitely, on the landing below, buried in the physical and ethical rubble of his family's legacy. Thorn walked past startled night shift officers, his focus absolute. He bypassed the holding cells and the main desk, heading directly for the chief's empty office. He needed security, communication, and a clear path to expose the Rauks. He locked the chief's door and placed the evidence crate on the polished mahogany desk. He opened the crate and pulled out the two crucial pieces. Marcus Rauk's leather journal, detailing the 3 curated cases, and the miniature digital receiver Rauk had activated. The receiver's solid red light pulsed slowly, a beacon indicating a successful transmission and active connection to the next curator. Thorn picked up the phone. He called internal affairs, then the state police, Then the district attorney's office. All high-ranking officials he knew had not been involved in the Blackwood City system. He spoke with urgent, cold precision, recounting the structural collapse, the discovery of the HSE network, and the evidence contained in the crate. He didn't sound frantic. He sounded like a man who had finally found the bottom of the deepest, darkest well. Within the hour, the precinct was flooded. Internal affairs investigators, state troopers, and forensic teams secured the sublevel 3 stairwell, confirming the massive collapse. Captain Rawak was apprehended and taken to a secure facility under heavy sedation. Thorne spent the next 6 hours meticulously presenting the evidence. The journal entries, the broken tapes, the hand-drawn maps, and the final, horrifying piece of evidence, the silent carver's preserved vocal cord. The case was no longer cold. It was a conspiracy that stretched back 40 years, implicating a line of police, curators, who managed the dark history of Blackwood City. As dawn broke, casting long, pale shadows across the chief's office, the head of internal affairs, Chief Inspector Eleanor Rice, a woman known for her iron will, finished reviewing the last file, the personal diary of Marcus Rauch. "This is unprecedented," Thorne, Rice said, her voice strained. "A generational conspiracy operating within the department to protect the Carver and others, classifying them as necessary catalysts for the archive. It's monstrous." Thorne pointed to the blinking red receiver. "That's the final threat, Chief." Rauch activated a remote transfer. The entire digital archive, the HSE data, is now with the next curator. They have the names, the locations, and the protocols. Rice nodded, her eyes fixed on the small device. "We have traced the receiver's initial ping. It bounced off a private server network, untraceable. But we have a final, single GPS location transmitted right before Rauch was sedated." She slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a single Blackwood City Street address, an ordinary house number in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. "We have teams mobilizing now," Rice stated. "We don't know who this curator is. It could be anyone, anywhere in the city. A civilian, another officer, a relative. We need to move fast before they destroy the digital file or activate another loop." Thorne stood up, retrieving his tire iron. "I'm going with them." "No, detective. You're compromised, exhausted, and you're the target. You just survived a deliberate attempt on your life. We need you to stay here and cross-reference the digital restoration of Sublevel 3's records. What little we can salvage. This is a secure operation." Thorne met her gaze, his eyes hard and unwavering. "This isn't about data, Chief. Rauch's family has been watching me for 2 years. The carver marked my victim with my initial. The next curator is waiting for me. They need the final act. If I'm not there, they'll know something is wrong and they'll destroy the file. I am the bait, Rice. And I'm the only one who knows the HSE protocol." Rice hesitated, considering the cold logic of his argument. After a moment, she relented. "Fine. You go with the lead tactical team. But you follow every order. You are not to engage. You are strictly an observer." She handed him a tactical vest and a standard issue sidearm. Thorne put on the vest. It felt heavy, but comforting. He looked down at the brass key still clutched in his hand, the key to the ruined archive. He placed the key onto the mahogany desk. Letting go of the pass. He grabbed the small, red pulsing receiver. "Let's go meet the inheritance." Minutes later, Thorne was in an unmarked black sedan, speeding toward the coordinates on the suburban map. The rising sun was weak, illuminating the wet, grey streets of Blackwood. He was heading into the quietest part of the city, toward the most dangerous file in the history of the police department. The physical archives were gone, But the digital ghost, the final truth of the HSE, was alive and well, waiting in an unsuspecting house. The true horror had just begun. The tactical convoy was silent, gliding through the early morning streets of Blackwood. The address on the GPS led them to Willow Creek, a neighborhood of quiet suburban conformity, where every lawn was manicured and every secret was sealed behind identical front doors. The location, a modest, two-story house, completely unremarkable. Thorne sat beside the lead tactical officer, Lieutenant Vera Martinez, a woman whose face was etched with grim focus. The plan was a soft breach, containment, and seizure of the digital evidence before the next curator could react. Martinez looked at the red blinking receiver in Thorne's hand. The signal is strongest here. It's coming from inside that house. Thorne gripped the device. The red light pulsed with the slow, steady rhythm of a resting heart. He's waiting. Rauk ensured the transfer was complete before the crash. This person is fully briefed on the HSE history. The team deployed, securing the perimeter. Thorne and Martinez approached the front door. Martinez raised her hand, signaling a pause, and prepared to breach. "Wait," Thorne said, his voice low. He walked past her and rang the doorbell. The sound of the chime was absurdly normal. Cutting through the tense silence, Thorne lowered his head to the small intercom speaker mounted near the door. "It's Detective Thorne. We need to talk about the archive." A moment of silence, then a clear, calm, and utterly familiar voice responded through the speaker. "I expected you, Elias." Rauk always was too eager. "Come in. The final file is ready." Thorne's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. It was the voice of Dr. Adrian Hemlock, the head psychologist who had conducted Thorne's mandatory psychological evaluation after the Silent Carver case 2 years prior. Hemlock had signed the papers clearing Thorne, sending him into the archive. Hemlock, Thorne whispered, the acronym suddenly making terrifying sense. HSE was not just Rauk's family. It was a psychological system of control. Martinez raised her weapon. "Thorne, stand down. That's Dr. Hemlock." The door clicked open. Thorne pushed past Martinez, entering the house. The interior was spotless, bathed in the soft morning light. The smell was not the iron and mildew of the archive, but fresh coffee and cinnamon. Dr. Hemlock stood in the living room. He was impeccably dressed, holding a ceramic mug, and smiling faintly. "Welcome, Elias. Please, put the little trinket down. The transfer is complete. I am the archive now." Thorne aimed his weapon, his hand steady. The carver, Hemlock. The Rauks protected him because he was an intellectual asset to your curator system. You use the archive to maintain power and cover up crimes. Hemlock sighed, taking a slow sip of coffee. The carver was a genius. Yes, but he was only the pen, Elias. The curators are the editors. We maintain the balance. We decide which failures are necessary and which truths must be forgotten. Rauk's father knew you were breaking. We knew the only place you could truly be tested was in sublevel 3. He gestured to a large, antique wooden desk set up against the far wall. On the desk, connected to a laptop, was an external hard drive, its indicator light glowing steadily. The final, complete HSE file. The list of every protected individual, every cover-up, every curator in Blackwood and beyond. It's all there. The complete truth, Hemlock said calmly. "You're done, Doctor," Thorne growled. "We have the evidence." The journal, the vocal cord, Hemlock chuckled softly. "The physical trinkets? Relics for the weak-minded, Elias. My purpose was to see if you would destroy the system or become part of it. The HSE isn't a family or a system. It's a mindset. Did you notice that Raug's diary detailed 4 case codes on the schematic? 77-091, 82 to 203, 91 to 447, and 04-119. Hemlock set down his mug and walked slowly toward Thorn. There is no case 82 to 203 in the police system, Elias. That case doesn't exist. Marcus Rauch invented it as the ultimate test of the new curator. If the new curator, you, destroyed the archive before looking for 82 to 203, you were deemed too volatile. If you tried to save the system, you were ready for induction. Thorn felt a sick lurch in his stomach. He hadn't just destroyed evidence. He had destroyed the system before finishing the inventory. Just as Hemlock's protocol predicted. Hemlock pointed at the blinking red receiver in Thorn's hand. That device isn't just a receiver, Elias. It's an encryption key. And Rauch didn't send a ping to me. He sent it to the only person with the mental fortitude, the obsession, and the unique knowledge of the Carver case to unlock the final file. Hemlock extended his hand, his eyes burning with a terrifying, serene intensity. The HSC is only accessible by the one who is utterly broken, utterly obsessed, and has personally destroyed the physical evidence. The next curator is you, Elias. Head archival curator, Thorn. Hemlock tapped the red blinking receiver. You are holding the key, and you are the only one who can unlock the final file. You are the inheritance. Before Thorn could process the dizzying shift in reality, the kitchen door burst open. Lieutenant Martinez and the tactical team stormed the room, weapons raised. Freeze. Drop the weapon, Hemlock. Martinez yelled. Hemlock didn't flinch. He just looked at Thorn, a triumphant, sickening smile on his face. The choice is yours, Elias. Expose the truth and doom the city to anarchy. Or become the curator, maintain the silence, and truly close the loop. Hemlock raised his hands in surrender, allowing the officers to tackle and secure him. Thorn stood alone, the center of the room, holding the red pulsing encryption key. He stared at the laptop on the desk, containing the entire, locked digital history of the HSC conspiracy. He could turn the key over to the police, expose the network, and watch Blackwood City tear itself apart. Or he could pocket the key, let Hemlock take the fall, and become the silent, lonely guardian of the most terrible truths. He looked at the small, red light on the key, which suddenly turned off, plunging the device into darkness. The link was broken. The choice was made. He reached into his jacket pocket, feeling the cold leather of Marcus Rauch's journal. The whispers had stopped, but the silence he inherited was more terrifying than any scream. Thorn turned to Lieutenant Martinez, placing his weapon on the floor. The file is locked, Lieutenant.